Hey guys, it's Jay. Welcome back to my channel, where we discuss the popular culture of the 70s, 80s, and 90s. I really wanted to talk about Spider-Man today. No, not the latest movie which just got released. I'm talking about the 1967 animated Spider-Man. A lot of people have different ideas of what Spider-Man is, and that actually comes from the idea that they grew up on very many different types of Spider-Man. Some people grew up in the 90s Spider-Man. Other people grew up with Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. Myself, I grew up with the 1967 version of Spider-Man. You'll find the Spider-Man! Now, this being one of the original 1967 versions of Spider-Man, it really was a little bit closer to what the original idea of Stan Lee's Spider-Man was when he came out in the comics. Spider-Man is, well, Peter Parker is a nerd. And he actually shows up going to college, having adventures, and dating girls, being bullied in a lot of ways. And for me, growing up in this time, I really could relate to Peter Parker and his mishapped adventures.
Gee, I'm sorry, fellas, but I have to catch a demonstration of radioactivity.
A bona fide, true-to-life bookworm.
It's kind of funny, because the series itself actually doesn't start out with an origin episode as we're used to today. When the series started out, the very first episode was Spider-Man discovering Dr. Octopus's cave. Kind of funny, but in a way, it really did show the times. Spider-Man really was an icon even back then, as the masked hero had already ingrained himself into popular comics culture at the time. Although his adventures didn't start out with an origin story, in Season 2, we finally do eventually find out how Peter Parker gets his powers. We probably all know the tale. The way Ralph Bakshi, the actual director of the original 1967 version, showcases Spider-Man's origin story, it's actually quite interesting. He has his classic psychedelic look, which adds a little bit of atmosphere to the way Peter Parker actually becomes bitten by the radioactive spider. The colors, they really do lend themselves to the idea that Peter is really tripping out. He's in a daze and confused. And it's a wonderful reimagining of the way Stan Lee had actually told a story in Fantastic Tales. Although, it's one of the most closely resembling versions of the story that Stan Lee had originally wrote.
Ouch, something bit me. It was just a spider. Why do I feel so strange, so different?
In Season 1, Peter, or Spider-Man, fights some very classic villains, including Dr. Octopus, Mysterio, the Green Goblin. But his main enemy appears to be Jonah Jameson, the head of the Daily Bugle. As many of us are undoubtedly aware, Jonah Jameson has a poor opinion of Spider-Man, always considering him to be a fraud or some sort of hooligan who's just trying to get publicity using his newspaper. It's kind of funny. And actually, this transcends into the actual cartoon itself, as it appears Jonah Jameson is more important than the mayor himself. Most of the villains in the series actually write to the Daily Bugle, naming Jameson himself and actually having him report on their misgivings, and actually warning Jameson instead of the police or even the mayor, of all things, about their crimes. Kind of strange.
To prevent loss of life, I have sent Jameson a warning of my plan. As a matter of fact, he should have the letter by now.
I shall demolish the area charted. Advise removal of all residents before demonstration.
Because through this little dynamic, Peter Parker, who is a mild-mannered photographer who actually works for the Daily Bugle, actually gets an inside scoop as to what the next villain's moves are. And I find that really interesting in this series, as it really helps Spider-Man to have an edge on all of his opponents.
Miss Brandt, have this printed on our front page. Give it feature billing. At last, I've got Spider-Man where I want him, in my web.
If Spider-Man wants to know the truth about the Midtown Museum robbery, he must meet Mysterio on top of the Brooklyn Bridge at dawn.
The series is not without its controversies. The original director, Ralph Bakshi, and the animation studio, Grant Trey Lawrence, tried to cut back on their production by reusing frames from an older TV series that they had done previously, Rocket Robin Hood. You'll notice quite a similar types of enemies and scenes which happen almost identically and pacing-wise from Rocket Robin Hood directly into Spider-Man. It's kind of scary, but in a lot of ways, the animation studio which actually produced Spider-Man in 1967 was very low budget, as you can see in a lot of the animations themselves. Although the animation seems dated by today's standards, I really do enjoy the original 1967 version of the animated Spider-Man. It has a certain charm about it. The psychedelic colors, the actual animation itself, which mostly was rotoscoped, and you can thank Ralph Bakshi for that, who's famous for his rotoscoped animation quality. It really does harken back to a time of a simpler nature. And a lot of the animations, which were simply done, almost like talking heads with slight little movements, little talking mouths, it kind of recognizes and homages, if you will, the comics, which its original source material had come from. Ironically, the most iconic thing to come out of the 1967 version of Spider-Man was not his animation style, but it actually was, and still is today, the animation theme song, written by Bob Harris and Paul Francis Webber. This song, which has been referenced in many pop culture events, has been sampled by other artists, it's been referenced in television and movie trivia, and more recently, it's actually been used in the opening sequence of the new version of Spider-Man Homecoming. Now, I definitely can't talk about the wonderful theme song without also talking about the amazing soundtrack, which was produced and conducted by Ray Ellis. It really was a period type of music. We're talking about the 1960s here. So it was a wonderful little mix of jazz and classical music, harkening back to the time of hot rods and old cars, and in a lot of ways, gangsters and really downtown New York. It was amazing.
Fasten your seatbelts.
This being a Spider-Man series, we were treated to many of Spider-Man's classic villains, including Dr. Octopus, Dr. Smarter, the Lizard Man, Dr. Curtis Connors, the Vulture, Electro, the Sandman, Mysterio, and the Scorpion. 6 of those villains went on to form the Sinister Six. The only one who didn't really show up in the series was Kraven, probably for well-known reasons later on down the road. Other notable appearances were the Green Goblin, the Rhino, and the Phantom. Speaking about Spider-Man and the supervillains who accompanied him, the voice cast was a talented group who was working at the 1967 version of Spider-Man at the time, including Paul Soles as Spider-Man and Peter Parker, Paul Kilman as J. Jonah Jameson, Peg Dixon, who voiced pretty much every woman in the entire animated version of the 1967 Spider-Man, including Betty Bryant, the secretary, Miss Connors, May Parker, Peter's aunt, and even Mary Jane Watson, Vernon Chapman as Dr. Octopus, Gilly Fenwick, who voiced both the Lizard Man and the Vulture, Tom Harvey, who voiced Electro and the Sandman, Chris Wiggins as Mysterio, Carl Banas as the Scorpion, Len Carlson as the Green Goblin, and Ed McNamara as the Rhino. The 1967 animated version of Spider-Man really was a look back into such an iconic character from the 1960s. The period was so charming. We had hot rods, guys going to school, girls who were just getting into the idea of working in a male industry and society. It really was an interesting time to be alive. And Spider-Man himself showcased the idea that someone who wasn't traditionally a hero could rise above everything else and become something more than himself. I really enjoyed the 1967 version. Ralph Bakshi's signature style and psychedelic nature really shines through. If you haven't seen the series, I do suggest you take a look at it. It's a wonderful example of early animation from the comic book era. And I think it might be available on DVD and Blu-ray right now. You probably would want to look on Amazon or eBay. Well guys, that'll about do it for my look back at Spider-Man, the 1967 animated series. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a like. It really helps me out. If you have any comments or suggestions on cartoons, collectibles, anime, or anything else you'd like me to review, please leave that in the comment section below. And consider subscribing, as I have many more episodes on the way. Also, please consider sharing this with someone who you think might enjoy it. Well guys, as always, thank you very much for watching. Geek Proud. Check out some of the other episodes I've done. You can also follow me on Facebook and Twitter.